Hello, this is Jesse Phillips of Waypoint Technology Group. Wanted to give you guys another tech tip. This week we'll be talking about Trimble external radio setup, tips, and troubleshooting. We'll mostly be focusing on the Trimble's newest external radio, the TDL450B, but many of the things we discuss and many of the principles would also apply to older models like the 450HX, H, or L models. So what we'll cover today, we're going to review the hardware and cables and antennas involved with the TDL450B and external radio setup, and also some field tips. Secondly, we'll highlight the 450B display on the unit itself and some of the settings within. And finally, we'll get into Trimble Access and look at the Basin Rover options and the Basin Rover data link and how to configure that within the Trimble Access survey style, so everything is working properly. As far as what you'll need, a Trimble external radio like the 450B, HX, H, or L. You'll need the power, communication, and antenna cables, and also an antenna, like a 0 or 5 dB antenna, which we'll elaborate more on that later. You also need a data collector running Trimble Access and Basin Rover GNSS receivers. Alright, so we'll start with the hardware review and some field tips. These are kind of the power cables that come with the 450B model. I've also included the part numbers to make it more clear what cable I'm referring to, and these are right on the cables. This one on the left, the SAE power cable, you could use that directly with a Trimble field battery. You could plug in via the SAE connection here. If you don't have a Trimble field battery with an SAE connection, they include this SAE to battery clips on the right, so you can power your radio with any 12-volt battery. One warning in the user guide is to not use older version cables with the new 450B to power the unit. So don't use these two part numbers up at the top left here. Another note is you always want to connect the radio to your power source after all other cables have been connected. So this power cable, that's going to go in the bottom left port, the bigger port on the 450B, and the other end will connect to your battery. So next are the data cables. So this cable allows the external radio to communicate with your GNSS receiver, and depending on what model Trimble receiver you have, most models would use the one on the left, which is a serial data cable with this part number here. If you do have a Trimble R780, since it doesn't have a serial port, you'd use this one on the right, the USB data cable, and that data cable is going to connect to the bottom right port on the 450B, and the other end will plug into the port on the GNSS receiver. So next is antenna cables and antennas, certainly an important part of this whole setup. So you can use a few different options for antenna cables. This one on the right here, this is the one that Trimble used to sell a lot, just like a standard 9-foot or so long cable with a TNC connector. This is one from Western States. It's longer, a little heavier duty cable, but very similar TNC connector on one end, and then your antenna, like the antenna below here, screws onto this base. So you see this is a newer model from Trimble. This is a 0 dB and a 5 dB kind of combo kit. So the 0 dB would be the smaller antenna, and the 5 dB is the longer whip antenna. So depending on your environment, basically 0 dB, the smaller one here would radiate more energy higher in the vertical plane, so they're more useful in mountainous and metropolitan areas with tall buildings. The 5 dB whip, that radiates more energy toward the horizon compared to a 0 dB, so they're best used in flatlands and open areas. A couple tips with antennas. The height of your antenna, that's going to be the most important contributor to increasing radio range, much more than turning up the wattage or otherwise. So definitely something to keep in mind. Another thing to note is all of your older antenna cables and antennas that you used with older models of the TDL, like the HX, H, and L, they will still work with the 450B. One little tech tip is sometimes the prong on the bottom of the antenna, it can get too depressed, so it's not making a good connection when you screw it on. That could definitely contribute to some radio connection issues. So just keep in mind the rubber gasket that comes with an antenna. Oddly enough, it doesn't get installed in the antenna, but it gets installed on the base where the antenna mounts, and that should prevent that metal prong from being too depressed. This little rubber gasket often gets missed, and that can lead to issues later on, so definitely something to keep in mind. The antenna cable will be plugging into the top of the TDL450B into this TNC port. Another cable that comes with the 450B is this computer USB cable. So really the only time you'd need this is if you were trying to update the firmware using the Trimble Installation Manager. As far as hardware, one last thing to keep in mind is one note for this 450B is if you're operating in temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Trimble does recommend an optional fan tray. Otherwise, that is the gist of things on the hardware side. And next, let's jump into the display on the TDL450B. Alright, so this is the display of the TDL450B. You'll notice when it's plugged in, but it's not turned on, there'll be a solid red light next to power. So that means the correct voltage is applied, but the radio is off. Pretty simple display here. Besides your screen, you've got a back button, a power button, up and down, and then an OK or an enter. So if we press the power button and turn it on, the power light should go green, meaning the correct voltage is applied and the radio is on. If you've used the 450HX, H, or L, you'll see the display is very similar. You also have just a couple other LEDs indicating Bluetooth, indicating it's transmitting, and indicating it's receiving. So you can go through some of these menus. Basically, you see from the home screen, it tells you what channel you're on, the frequency that it's transmitting on. TTV1, that's Trim Talk version 1, that's the radio mode that it's in at 9600, the link rate 12.9 volts, and you'll see it's currently set to transmit at 5 watts. So all the important stuff is right on your home screen. To access some of the menus, you can hit the OK button, and you can start scrolling up and down through the menus. And first we want to elaborate a little bit more on the wireless settings. So I'll select that. So the first one is radio mode. So you can choose if you want it to be in rover or base mode, if you want it to be a repeater, if you have a setup as a base with one repeater. So probably most common is the rover base option. We'll choose rover base. It's also important to know most of the important settings you can set either on board the TDL450 or within Trimble Access when you're connected to the radio via the receiver. Besides the radio mode, you can look at your frequency table for transmitting and receiving. You can select what channel. So right now we're on 462.375. The wireless mode. This is one of the big three things that you need to pay attention to make sure your base and rover can communicate with each other. So the mode needs to be the same. So the most common one, normally most recommended, is TTV1 at 9600. And you should be able to set your rover to match that. So we'll choose that. TX power, so you can set your transmit power all the way up to 35 watts. Normally we avoid setting it that high just because the higher the wattage, the hotter the radio will run. So it's recommended to set it the lowest wattage where you can still get the range that you need. There's also an auto TX function. There's a couple different modes for the display, a simplified or expert mode. So when it's in expert mode, this is why you see additional options like Auto TX. This is a feature, can scan the transmit channels in the radio to determine which channel is the least noisy. And after the scan, it lists the current channel, followed by a list of the least noisy channels. So it's helpful in finding the least noisy channel to transmit on. If we go back to the main menu, into Bluetooth, that's where if you want to set up a Bluetooth connection between the radio and your receiver, if you're not using the serial data connection, the cable. The only time that would be necessary is if you're using an R580 that doesn't have a serial data port, a LEMO port. In most instances, an R10, R12, R780, R980, those can all be hardwired, so you don't need to use Bluetooth. If that's something you're interested in, there is a technical sheet from Trimble that goes over how to set up a Bluetooth connection. If we look at device settings, here's the user interface level that I was talking about. So if you want to set it to simplified or expert, most often probably simplified is fine, but if you do want that auto transmit where it looks for the least noisy frequency, you do need to switch into expert mode. Serial port settings, so this is important. This controls how the radio communicates with the GNSS receiver. So this needs to match on both, and you'll see this within Trimble Access too. You need to specify the speed. So by default, the 450B is at 115/200 and parity none. One last thing in the main menu is setting profiles. So this is kind of a new add to the 450B. You can set up to 10 profiles, and that'll basically save all of your important settings with, whether it's the channel you're transmitting on, the wireless mode, the power level. It'll back it up as a profile so you can quickly restore the settings instead of always just manually toggling through the menus. All right, so those are the major settings on the display. All right, so next let's jump into reviewing the Trimble Access survey style and how this all comes together in Access. All right, so we're in Trimble Access. We've got our base receiver and our rover GNSS receivers powered on. Today I'm using an R12 as a base and R12i as a rover. We have our TDL450B powered on. We have all the cables connected. We've got the power supply connected to it. We've got a cable running from the TDL450B to the base receiver. We've got an antenna cable running from the radio to the antenna. So some of the first settings you want to kind of ensure are in order in Trimble Access are, if you go to the burger button and settings and connections, you want to make sure your Bluetooth connections are configured properly. So you want to make sure the R12 base serial number is under the connect to base field, and the R12i serial number is under the GNSS rover field. If you need to add Bluetooth connections, if you haven't set these up yet, you could hit search and you can connect to the receiver and assign whether it'll be a base or a rover. So since you can only connect to one receiver at a time, it's important to specify what's the base and what's the rover in the Bluetooth connections menu. So I've already assigned those. You'll see I'm already connected to the R12. That's why I have this base icon. So we're going to look at the survey style settings for the Trimble TDL450B and how that'll work. So if we go to the burger button, settings and survey styles, we could just create a new survey style, call it TDL450B, and it is a GNSS style type. We'll hit accept, and then we're going to focus on these first four: the rover options, rover data link, base options, and base data link. The rest are really user specific and your preferences, but the first four are essential. So we'll start with the base, since I'm connected to the R12 as my base receiver. And you can choose the survey type, just traditional RTK, or you could do something like RTK and logging if you wanted to log raw data at the base. We'll just stick with RTK for today. The broadcast format is the third of the big three. We looked at the link rate, the TrimTalk version 1 at 9600. We looked at the frequency, like 461.025 or something similar. The third one is the broadcast format. These must match on both the base and the rover. So we're set to CMRX. We'll choose the R12, bottom of quick release. This all looks good. We'll hit accept. Next we'll look at the base data link. So one important thing to note for the base and rover data link, you can access those radio settings or these data link settings in the radios, whether it's you're accessing the settings in the TDL450B or within an internal radio for like an R12 and R12i. It's important to note these settings they're not stored within Trimble Access. They're actually stored within the radios themselves. You're just accessing it. So under base data link, you want to make sure the type is radio. Now if you were using the R12's internal radio, you'd use receiver internal, but we're using an external radio. You should find the TDL450B if you're using newer versions of Access. If you have an older version, you could set it up as a custom radio and just make sure your baud rate matches what you set on the 450B. This is how the receiver communicates with the radio. This has nothing to do with transmitting, but remember the baud rate was 115/200, the parity was none, and the receiver port is most often 1. So you could click that and hit accept. This is if you don't have the TDL450B option in your drop-down. If you do, it's a little more straightforward. So most often you're going to be connecting to port 1 on the GNSS receiver, so it's port 1 on the R12, and it already has my default baud rate, parity none, and there's an option to connect. So as long as my receiver and radio are powered on and they're connected with that serial data cable, you can hit connect, and it should connect to the TDL450B. And see, you can manipulate here most of the important settings that we were looking at on the visual display on the 450B itself. So you can change the radio operating mode if you want it to be a base, a rover, or a repeater. In this case, it's a base. You can choose the frequency. Remember, these transmit frequencies have to be assigned by a dealer. You can't manually enter these. Trim Talk version 1 at 9600. If you are going to have a repeater in your chain, you'd have to configure that here, but we're not using repeaters today. And then you can also change the power level up to 35 watts. I'm just going to stick at 1 watt since we're just right next to the office today. This enable station ID, this is where you would enter your call sign. The FCC does require it, so this is where you'd enter your unique call sign associated with your FCC license. I'll hit accept, and that basically set those radio settings on the 450B the same way I could do on the display. So I'll hit accept. Then I'll make sure my rover options and rover data link are in order too. We're going to be in RTK. Remember, the broadcast format needs to match. CMRX on both base and rover. If you have an older receiver, you might be stuck to CMR Plus, but CMRX is the newest Trimble proprietary broadcast format. I'm going to be using an R12i, and the rest of these we can just make sure L5 is enabled, and we should be able to hit accept. Then on the rover data link, this is where we're going to configure the radio at the rover in the GNSS rover receiver. So we're going to use the internal radio of the receiver. I'm still connected to the base though. You can see by this icon. So I'm going to switch over to the rover by hitting this rover soft key. Now that should force a Bluetooth connection to my rover receiver, the R12i. Yep, there we go. It's connected to the rover now. Now you should be able to connect to the R12i rover radio. So this one's going to be operating in rover mode. Trim Talk version 1 at 9600. That's the same as I set on the 450B, so that's good. And then I just need to make sure I set this the same, which I believe I set it to 462.375. We can hit accept. So that will set the rover radio. And just remember, these settings, although you can access them in the survey style, they do reside on the radio. So if you're using a different receiver, these settings are not going to hold from one receiver to another, just because you access them in the survey style. So you'll need to check this each time, base data link and rover data link, if you're using different radios, if you're using different receivers. So that should be good there. We can hit store, and we should be good to test out our survey style. So I'm going to go and switch into base mode. So it forces a connection to my R12 base. And as long as we've configured the survey style correctly, our TDL450B external radio-based RTK setup should work. So to test out our survey style, I'll go to the burger button to measure TDL450B, and then I'm not measuring points, but I'm starting base receiver. This is just a new job with no points in it, so I'm just going to key in a point, and you're going to use the here position, just get an autonomous position. I'll call it 0.1. I'm going to use that to start my base. I'm going to estimate the height. I measure the bottom of quick release. I can change my station index, which is just a unique identifier, so I know I'm connecting to my base station, but we can leave it at 3, and I don't want to set any delay. So I'll hit start, and base started. Now once you hit OK, you should see the TX light illuminating on the TDL450B. So it should look something like this. Now that we have the base started, we can go and measure points. We can go to measure and then TDL450B, and it should force a connection to the rover, and we should be able to start measuring points. So my reliability is 100%. I can see I'm receiving the data from my TDL450B. Looks like the transmitting is successful. If I hit accept, gotta align my IMU, and there we go. We're a good 5 by 700. If you want to check and make sure how good your connection is, you can go up here to the little radio. We got 100% reliability. Yeah, things are looking good. And then remember, when shutting down, the proper way to end the survey at the rover and then the base, you'd want to go to GNSS functions. You can go to end survey. You can choose whether or not to power down receiver. I'll say yes in this case. So that's for the rover, how to end the rover survey properly. I'll switch into base mode. So instead of just going to the base or GNSS functions and end survey, the proper way would be go to the menu, back to measure, like how we started the base receiver, to the survey style, and then there's an end GNSS base survey. and you can choose once again whether or not to power down the receiver. And TDL450 should still be powered on, so you'll have to power that off manually with the button on the screen. So to wrap things up, this is Jesse Phillips with Waypoint Technology Group. Thanks a lot for your time today. Please feel free to reach out to us at Waypoint. We're a land surveying and mapping distributor for Trimble. You can reach out to our help portal at waypointtech.freshdesk.com. Email tech support at waypointtech.com. You can also look at our YouTube channel or reach out to the number above. Thanks again.